it brings some other things. It allows you to rediscover part of the tradition that was hidden, that was left out from the view, as I think Piłsudski was for quite a while, and Ficowski completely. He was looked at as a scholar of Schulz, as a scholar of the gypsies in Poland, very serious book he wrote on the subject. As someone who earned his living writing lyrics to songs. So, and someone who, yes, that didn't make him a serious poet, so to say. He was translating wonderfully some anonymous folk poetry from Romania and Bulgaria. Fantastic stuff. And he translated them as well as the, I don't know what to give you, as for instance the Polish translation of A Great Testament by François Villon is a great translation. It's part of the Polish tradition. It's so good. I'd say that Ficowski did the anonymous folk poetry sound that strong that you just couldn't not be completely, it's like a big discovery. And Ficowski was completely left out from the view, and together with a bunch of others like Miłopenska and Wirpsa, names that you wouldn't know in this country that much. But part of that is, the reason for that is that it's always very useful and handy to have the Warsaw Quartet, the Alexandrian Quartet, right? We had, and that was such a handy thing to have 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 poets who were supposed to represent, because they were in a specific, quite interesting line, but killing in a way, that is, making it disappear from the view, the other lines, and that's the moment for the other lines when you're a little bit bored and fed up with the main track, mainstream of what has been happening. For instance, the Czesław Miłosz anthology of post-war Polish poetry, such an important book, and I admire Miłosz greatly for what he did for the Polish writing in the States, in the English language. He introduced the fact to the American audience. He did the book with Leonard Nathan. He did the My Century book, basic book, I think, for anybody interested in Eastern Europe, and beautiful book, very moving book. A spoken memoir by Alexander Watt. And he did this, he did a number of other things, but I meant to mention the anthology, post-war Polish poetry anthology, which is a great book. Even today, 50 years after it was first published, it's still a very interesting book, and it probably made many American poets realize a number of things that they needed to realize, and made them realize what you can do with a poem at a certain point that American poetry didn't do, perhaps. And but at the same time, I mean to say that there was a but coming. But at the same time, that's the anthology that left out a number of names that didn't suit Miłosz's taste. Right? You can never do anything that would make sense without your taste. The taste, therefore, I find my students who I really, there's a bunch of students in this class that I'm having here that I really love, and because I have a sense that I have sort of understanding of what we're doing instantly, and even if we disagree. But yes, and then I keep asking, do you like it? Do you like it? And it's a difficult question for them. That's the question that seems to be more difficult than other questions. Somehow they feel a little bit intimidated to say, to respond to that particular way of my question. So I meant to say, Miłosz had a limited taste, a very broad taste, in fact, but still limited. So Ficowski was not in it. Białoszewski was in it with a few poems, and they were a little bit, I mean, they could be translated better. Maybe one is a very well translated one, the Ballad of Going Down to the Store is great, but the ode to the inexhaustible joy is maybe not that well done. Anyway, I don't mean to qualify translations. I didn't mean that. I meant to say that there is a number of factors in a given moment of literary history that determine the fact that certain names are going to be looked at with more attention than others. And that was the case with these poets in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And they dominated the scene so strongly that now people are surprised that there is a number of other tradition poets, as Ashbery says, the other traditions, right? That's the way he discovered this. You mentioned Frank O'Hara, but back in those days, I didn't even cross my mind that there was another poet who Ashbery really dug out from nowhere, and his name is David Schubert. And he wrote a rather loving piece about David Schubert in his Other Traditions book. And because of that book, because he's such an influential reader and writer, David Schubert all of a sudden came to view. He said, Marjorie Perloff said he was kidding or something, joking perhaps, that David Schubert, who died in the asylum when he was 33 or 4, mad, completely mad, having destroyed everything but a bunch of poems that his widow saved and eventually in the early 60s published, having destroyed everything and the novel that he wrote, except for one sentence, which is the first sentence of the novel, which goes outside. It was Tuesday. And anyway, David Schubert. I read David Schubert and translated a bunch of the poems from this little book of poems by David Schubert. Is such an active, such a wonderful poet that only now I think I realize, despite the fact that he's really uneven because he was really young and mad and everything, there's quite a bit of almost adolescent stuff, but the 20-odd poems in that little book that are good are just great, are just incredibly. I mean, the New York school poets wouldn't have been, Ashbery wouldn't have been Ashbery, it seems to me, and Frank O'Hara wouldn't have been Frank O'Hara. The way that they are different, completely different, but at the same time you can spot to the moments in the David Schubert poems that you see how indeed that must have been important to them back in the 40s when they were students, you know, and they were probably circulating a bunch of those manuscripts. So I'm coming back to the influence of Frank O'Hara on the fact that this other tradition that maybe Białoszewski has become a little bit more quite a bit more than he used to be, of a very serious, very important writer, and that I may be wrong about that, but I do think that the foreign is opening the eyes to the things that you didn't know, perhaps somehow overlooked. It was easy to overlook because you were so involved in the polemics, or you were so stupid, and you didn't see, or you were so much influenced by the current view, short-sighted, conformist view of the critics, and so on, right? I mean, that thing can happen as well.
I'm going to ask a last question and open it up. You've taught in the United States for a number of years, well over 20 years, right? I mean, you first came here. Yes.
I'm not at home.
Yes, you are.
No.
I'm curious. I mean, when you first came to the States and taught for the first time in '87 or '88 at Amherst.
88.
In '88. Has your experience of teaching American students changed your perspective, even on Polish poetry or on poetry and translation? Or, I mean, can you talk a little bit about maybe your experience of pedagogy and poetry?
Well, I was invited to
and translation as well.
To teach as a visiting writer back then at Amherst College prematurely. They didn't know I was completely incompetent, and I didn't know I could be competent even. It was such a stressful experience, but it really taught me quite a bit, that first one. And I, through reading so much of Polish and East European poetry, but not just that. Also, I was teaching quite a bit of American poetry and English and Irish poetry to American students. So it certainly changed my my perception of what these poets are. Sometimes I stopped liking certain Polish poets because of that experience. Because when you read, say, early Herbert in Polish, he's terrific. When you read him in English, even though he's well served in translation, he's so much less interesting that you eventually come to think, well, that's a reduced version of it, and oh yes, I understand why they don't really like it, and you completely helpless because they don't know the language. So there's this great model for her, Konstantinos Kavafi, who is rather well served in English too. So also, if you put Kavafi together with some of the parabolic East Europeans, I mean that's the original that you taste and on the palate much more easily. You can sense how good he is than the East Europeans. It seems to me most of the time. So yes, it changed my perception. Also, I rather like Szymborska in Polish. Whenever she is not very pedagogical, she tends to be very good. She, unfortunately, is a little bit pedagogical too often. But we'll survive that because we like her and she's such a lovely creature herself, in addition to that.
And she probably works really well in the classroom.
Right, that's right. But then she gets so reduced too. So even the poets that you would imagine are easy enough to translate do not come out that well. So it has changed my opinion about a number of them. But in case of someone like Białoszewski, it has even confirmed my great faith in the untranslatability, because if everything were translatable, just, word by word, and you could whisper it to you, I could whisper everything to your ear now, and give you what is the most sacred music in my language, it wouldn't feel good. I think there is some sense in the fact that certain things we can only aspire to have in our own languages, whereas we cannot. And it's also terrific.
There's a lot of other questions that I have for you on that as well, but since we don't have a whole lot of time, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Is that okay? Yeah, sure.
Since I know you've translated a lot of American poets into Polish, I suppose the specific, just picking up on your last, have your perceptions of your own failures to translate American poets into Polish